Some of you may know, Luc Chantre, so as an assistant professor, has worked extensively on the history of the Hajj to Mecca, and mostly the Hajj from the French colonial countries in North Africa. He has recently published his PhD thesis, which I think you could see behind me. And soon the CEFREPA, in the next few months, will publish the Arabic translation of the same thesis to Arabic. So Al-Hajj fi Ayyam al-Isti'mal, to the CEFREPA edition house. Luc is going to speak for half an hour, and afterward we will take a moment to ask him any question we shall have. Luc, I leave you the floor for this challenging and thrilling lecture. Thank you, Luc.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Philippe, for this generous presentation. First of all, I'd like to thank you and to thank Abbas Zouache for your invitation, because as a researcher at CEFREPA, it's always for me a pleasure to attend and participate in seminars and lectures like this one with a high quality audience. Well, I'm going to present in 30 minutes, very challenge, in a very poor English, the broad topic of the pilgrimage to Mecca during colonial times. The first question, I think, when we study such a topic is why? Why non-Muslim powers have increasingly invested in the organization of the Hajj during the 19th and 20th century? Because at the beginning, the very beginning of the 16th century, indeed, the first European traveler to enter the holy city of Mecca, is an Italian merchant, Ludovico di Valterra. And he described the Hijaz as a land of abundance, a little in the same way that his compatriot Marco Polo has described China, an exotic and remote country. During the 17th and 18th century, British and Dutch East India companies never really thought to interfere in the Hajj, on the ground that such interference would alienate them from the sympathy of Muslim merchants. Things started to change with the French expedition to Egypt from 1798 to 1801, when General Bonaparte, indeed, understood the political benefit he could get from the pilgrimage as a protector of the Egyptian caravan. Of course, he seized up the geopolitical stake of the Hajj on the road to India. At a time when a reverse alliance began to emerge from Upper Egypt and the Red Sea, supported by the British Navy, Bonaparte entered into correspondence with Sherif Khaleb of Mecca. The Hijaz was also a strategic place for Pasha Muhammad Ali, who wanted to restore the old Mamluk Empire. Many Europeans took part in this military campaigns from the 1810s to the 1840s. European soldiers, travelers, or scientists, such as Jean Prax. Jean Prax is probably the first French Haji. He is the first one who left a document, a diary, and his very personal diary, he tried to demonstrate the increasingly close relationship between the East and the West. And he wrote his diary just next to the Kaaba. It's something very, very, very precious, you know, maybe the first French document about the Hajj. But at that time, the relationships between West and East were chiefly consisted in colonial wars. In India, during the Anglo-Maratha Wars, political agents of the East India Company were reluctant to let Muslim princes go on pilgrimage. For their part, the Dutch authorities in Indonesia, at the beginning of the Java Wars in 1885, decided for the first time to introduce pilgrims' passports. And so did Russian troops during the Caucasian War at the same time. But colonial powers also use more peaceful means regarding the Hajj. For instance, in Algeria, the French General Bugeaud tried to organize in the 40s special caravans by steamers. His objective was to gain the favors of the Muslim notables against his war against Abdelkader. At that time, France had just opened a consulate in Jeddah in 1839. For his part, Russian Governor Golovin in the 40s tried to monitor a special pilgrimage for the Dagestani. And this Russian caravan, this is an overland caravan, gave the opportunity for Russia to open new consular offices in Aleppo and Damascus, intended to facilitate the transport of pilgrims from Central Asia to Hijaz. So, as in the great days of the Ottoman Empire, these caravans were religious as well as diplomatic ones. However, these political initiatives made a pause after the Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, when a part of the Indian army decided to rise against the colonial power. Many commentators of the time interpreted this rebellion as a revolt against British interference in religious affairs. And as a consequence, Queen Victoria promulgated a declaration of tolerance towards all her Hindu and Muslim subjects. This new context of tolerance allowed a princess, an Indian princess, the Begum of Bhopal, Nawab Sikandar, to perform freely her pilgrimage during the next decade, during the 60s, without any hindrances from the government of India, a free pilgrimage. Anyway, from the middle of the 19th century, new factors contribute to renew the European interest for the Hajj. First of all, the growing development of the steam navigation. Since 1859, Dutch steamers provide regular lines to the Holy Place. From the 60s, British shipping companies dominated the market, such as the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, the P&O, or the BI, the British India Steam Navigation Company. Technological innovation allow a growing number of pilgrims to perform their religious duties. 27,000 pilgrims were landing in Jeddah in 1868. There were 40,000 during the following decade, during the 70s. And they're reaching 100,000 on the eve of the Great War. So, you know, you have the new Suez Canal but also the technological factors, which allows ships bigger and bigger with at lower prices. This is the beginning of a low cost, low cost pilgrimage. Maritime arrival then got an increasing importance, and pilgrims from Southeast Asia remained the most numerous. There were average 13,000 Indonesian and more than 11,000 Indian pilgrims from the opening yearly, from the opening of the Suez Canal up to the Great War. But at the opposite, there were only 6,000 pilgrims from Russia and an average of 5,000 pilgrims from North Africa. Why such a difference between Southeast Asia pilgrims and African or Russian pilgrims? Well, as you can see of these photographs, the crossing conditions were very trying. And the pilgrims were at the mercy of epidemics. In 1865, imported from India, the cholera broke out during the pilgrimage, in the Hajj. And with the help of the steam navigation and railways, accompanied the pilgrims on their way back home. For the first time, a direct link was officially established between the pilgrimage to Mecca and the spread of cholera. So European countries put pressure on Egypt and the Ottoman Empire to install quarantine at the entrance and at the exit of the Red Sea. There's the station of Al-Tur next to Sinai and the station of Cameron, just in front of Udaydah. This health crisis also prompted the European powers to threaten, to comfort their diplomatic presence in the Hijaz by appointing consul and health doctors to inform the administration, the trading houses of the Hijaz health state. Another consequence was that each colonial government chose to strictly regulate and organize the departure on pilgrimage. For instance, in colonial Algeria at the end of the 19th century, the epidemic risk, the cholera, became a pretext to authorize or cancel departures. In 1894, the famous Algerian photographer converted to Islam, Jules Gervais Courtelmont, after several bans, finally gets the authorization to go on the pilgrimage, a personal authorization given by the Gouverneur General Cambon. But Gervais Courtelmont had to comply with many other obligations, such as passport, medical, and means test. Moreover, Algerian pilgrims couldn't choose their ship. For sanitary reasons, Algerian pilgrims had to travel on French boats to the delight and the profit of Marseille ship owners. For instance, la compagnie Cyprien Fabre, it was a very interesting market, for French ship owners at that time. On board, pilgrims were monitored by colonial agents who were required to enforce the sanitary regulation and to report any suspect behavior on the way there and on the way back. In Indonesia, pilgrims were subject to travel taxes and a special examination to check they have completed their pilgrimage. This examination, this measure, was strictly opposed by Christian Snoeker-Gronje. Snoeker-Gronje is a famous Dutch Orientalist who lived in 1985 within the Javanese community in Mecca, and he left a precious work about Meccan social life and the condition of Javanese pilgrims in the Hijaz. Snook declared himself very opposite, very hostile to any restriction on the Hajj. And chiefly this examination is for him a complete nonsense, absurdity, because for him, according to him, any educated Muslim will be able to pass this examination, whether or not he had completed his Hajj. The problem is that for their part, British authorities, faithful to the promise made by Queen Victoria, try to promote the freedom of pilgrimage, which means free trade and free navigation. But as imperial space became more and more interconnected, pilgrims seek to circumvent the rules to travel as freely as possible and at the lowest cost. For instance, many Javanese pilgrims chose at that time the port of Singapore to go on pilgrimage. The English and the Dutch authorities agreed to harmonize their regulation, obligation to hold a return ticket, obligation of a passport, and so on. Situation was more conflicting with Russia because of the struggles for influence in Central Asia. You know, the great game, le grand jeu, between Russia and the government of India, British government of India. Many Russian pilgrims, many Turkestani, prefer to depart from the Bombay, Surat, or Karachi harbors, rather than taking the railway from Tashkent to Odessa. So a Turkestani notable, Said Ghani Saidazimbaev, took the initiative at the beginning of the 20th century to charter special trains for Russian pilgrims. On the road, various agents were responsible for providing for the needs of the travelers, while the poorest pilgrims were offered free tickets. At Odessa, an agreement was made with the Dobroflot, so the national navy, commercial navy, to transport the pilgrims in the best possible conditions to Jeddah. This experience, however, was to turn into a fiasco because of the fear of the quarantine and other sanitary obligation. Most of Russian pilgrims prefer to travel by Indian ports. France had the same problems. Very strict regulation generated flows of illegal travelers who tried to reach Hijaz by any means. You see, as we see on this map, from Algeria, some try to board in Tanger, others in Tunis, some other try the experience of the overland pilgrimage through the Sahara, through desert. The problem is that the Maghrebian pilgrimage was very stagnant one. Here we can compare with the Indian pilgrimage. And this Algerian pilgrimage meets criticism from Hijaz traders and Hijaz brokers and French diplomatic authorities that took up with a very negative image of France in the Muslim world. That's the reason why diplomats and Muslim elites, such as the officer Mohammed Ben Sherif, militate for greater freedom. Ben Sherif championed the cause of many Algerian Muslims prevented from returning home for fear of prison. And that's why, on the eve of the Great War, Algerian authorities had to give up with many constraining practices. In the colonial managing of the Hajj, the Great War is an important shift, and it paves the way to new Hajj policies, more imperial, less colonial. In 1916, in order to support the Arab revolt, the British government took the initiative to resume the Hajj after 1 year of interruption. In the aftermath, French government decided to send a political delegation composed of Muslim notables from North Africa. The official mission of a French Muslim delegation was indeed to acquire a pilgrim hotel for destitutes in Mecca, so as to show the gratitude of the French government for their Muslim soldiers. But according to Sikadour Ben Gabrit, who was the head of his delegation, he was the chief of protocol of the Sultan of Morocco. According to Ben Gabrit, the objective, the aim of his mission was clearly to consolidate the French influence in the Middle East. And as a matter of fact, such an initiative had to worry French allies. Italy, for instance, the Italian government decided to duplicate the French method by sending a Muslim delegation from Libya and Eritrea in order to acquire a pilgrim hotel. For its part, British government, surprised by this unexpected competitor, decided to send to Mecca hundreds of soldiers from India and Sudan. Due to its cost, such an initiative could not be renewed after the war. After the war, travel prices were soaring, and the domestic situation of the Hashemite kingdom was somewhat chaotic. The number of North African pilgrims suddenly dropped, and French government delegated the Hajj organization to a Muslim private law association, la Société des Habous des Lieux Saints, run by Sikadour Ben Gabrit. At the same time, the government of India and Dutch government in Batavia had to face many criticism from the Khilafat movement. The government of India was keen to win back the Muslim trust by subsidizing poor pilgrims and cooperating with shipping companies such as the Mughal Line to solve problems relating to travel conditions. During the 30s and the rise of pan-Arab claims, the colonial goals are to depoliticize the Hajj. So colonial authorities had to pay attention to the pilgrim claims and meet their needs with comfort and safety. In this period of economic crisis, British government put pressure on Saudi kingdom to keep prices down. French government, for its part, intend to turn the hardships of travel into a kind of tourist trip. As you can see on this picture, an official printing published in 1935, a guide to pilgrimage to the holy places of Islam and tourism in the East, written in French and Arabic by Si Ahmed el-Hawari, which is a magistrate of the Sherifian High Court in Rabat. This guide contains pictures of the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, of the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, as well as the Sphinx of Gaza. This guide also proposed a return trip via Europe, via Bulgaria, Italy, France, and finally Spain, which was very common among Moroccan notables. As a matter of fact, this tourist pilgrimage made it possible to create a new imperial identity. While West African pilgrims usually travel to Mecca by foot in isolation, they were incited to travel by sea together with North African pilgrims. French authorities intended to promote the image of an united empire. That's why during the journey to Mecca, colonial administrators tried to connect Muslims from different African countries. Thus, at the outbreak of the Second World War, French and British authorities managed to organize a pilgrimage with a lot of propaganda. But with the defeat of 1940, delegations from North Africa suddenly stopped, while the Indian pilgrimage was interrupted in 1942 because of the Pacific Wars. This absence of colonial powers benefits new challengers like Egypt. Precisely after the Western Desert Campaign, the Moroccan fisher Ben Daoud had the idea to organize a pilgrimage by plane. From 1943 to 1945, and this pilgrimage was called the Pilgrimage of Victory, with the sending of a symbolic delegation of pilgrims from Maghreb, West Africa, and for the first time, the Comoros. At the end of the war, running out of ideas, colonial empires are recycling old recipes. In 1946, French, Dutch, and British colonial authorities took pretext of the shortage of ships to restore an official Hajj by sea. French government chartered a splendid liner and facilitated the pilgrimage of Indian Ocean notables. But not only notables. As a manifestation of the welfare state, the French government wanted to allow pilgrims of modest means, as well as war veterans, to perform the Hajj by checking the ticket prices. For its part, the government of India took care to charter at the last minute a special ship so that Indians can be once again the first nation invited to the house of God. However, the independence next year of India, Pakistan, and 2 years later of Indonesia sound like a swan song of this imperial moment of the Hajj. British government chose to refocus the organization of pilgrimage on Nigeria and Sudan, whereas French Western and Equatorial Africa administrators tried to organize overland pilgrimage by trucks through Sahelian Africa. The trip was painful. The pilgrims crossed rivers and swamps in the middle of the rainy season. They had to endure mosquitoes, mud, floods. Fortunately, the British agents in Sudan were very cooperative, in particular by reducing the health formalities, which allows the pilgrims to join the Hijaz just for the start of the ceremonies. But anyway, as the last colonial power to organize the Hajj, France has to face many complications in the 50s. First of all, logistical problems. On one hand, at the beginning of the 50s, the freedom of pilgrimage was recognized with the rise of pilgrimage by car, by trucks, or by planes. But on the other hand, colonial governments had to supply the adequate means of transportation for the poor or deprived pilgrims. That's why official pilgrimage by sea were maintained. France had to face political problems because its organization was increasingly criticized in the Hijaz or in Africa. French government must ensure of the loyalty of the African elites. And on November 1955, on his return from the pilgrimage, the Senegalese officers Fall and Abdou Salam Kane were invited to go to Paris at the invitation of the French government. They and their delegation were offered a guided tour of the great monument in Paris, Notre Dame, le Louvre, the Museum of Colonies, and of course, le Château de Versailles, Versailles Castle, which housed at the time the parliament of the French Union. The French Union was the French Colonial Federation at that time. Donc, you know, new kind of pilgrimage from Mecca to Paris. Finally, the French government had to cope with diplomatic problems. Chiefly after the beginning of the Algerian War of Independence and the Nasser's project to turn the Hajj into a Muslim forum. At the time, in 1955, the advisor of the French president, Chérif Méchéri, went to Mecca to perform his pilgrimage and to pay a diplomatic visit. But anyway, with the independence war, with the independence war in Algeria, Hajj progressively reassumed colonial and military goals. And we can notice the return of the colonial practices of the 19th century. For instance, in 1956, special authorizations were reinforced. Next year, overland pilgrimage from North and West Africa were forbidden, except by plane, as you can see. It has been proposed to open a French house of pilgrims in Jeddah, but with no other function than to identify Algerian pilgrims residing in the Hijaz and their link with the Algerian resistance. This was of no use. However, after having boycotted the pilgrimage, the Algerian Front de Libération Nationale, National Liberation Front, took progressively control of all the French buildings in the Hijaz, such as the French consulate in Jeddah and the Pilgrims Hotel in Mecca. At the beginning of the 60s, the French colonial Hajj, the last of the colonial pilgrimage, has lost its raison d'être. Thank you for your attention. So, if you have any question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luc. And thank you for keeping the time. You're perfectly on time. It's half an hour exactly. So many thanks to you for this fascinating presentation. We actually had a Russian history of the Hajj. We also have an Indonesian one and British one. And the last one maybe by Michael Christopher Lowe, an imperial account of the Hajj, including some Ottoman accounts, which is quite new as far as I know in this imperial story of the Hajj. And you just gave us the French version, including a global account, a survey of the history of the Hajj in the imperial context, monitoring the pilgrims, organizing the Hajj with sanitary measures, quarantine, tickets, and the shipping company. So yes, thank you very much for the fascinating lecture, which was both global and at the same time a French eye on the imperial Hajj. Before leaving the floor to our guests who might have some questions to answer, I just wanted to remind that the lecture is recorded. So if you want to ask your question on the text window, you can do, but you can also ask your question by opening your mic. Just send me a message on the window so that I can leave you opening your microphone. And while you're thinking about your question, I'm just using my privilege to ask two first questions to Luc. I did not fully understand what you tried to mean by when you said that in the interwar period, the French and British tried to implement a free Hajj for their pilgrims, and trying to also promote a kind of imperial identity among the pilgrims by gathering them on boats and ships, although it seems quite contrary to what they tried to do before the war and during the Hamidian period, Ottoman period, because they, I mean, as far as I know, at the end of the 19th century, they feared the concentration and gathering of pilgrims in Mecca, and they were quite wary of the possibility given to Arab and Muslim subjects to exchange ideas, speaking about colonies, speaking about, and it seems to me that the situation during the interwar period is quite different and probably contrary to what I expected. So could you just develop on that? Is it something that was really thought about by the imperial powers? Did they really want to do this, or was it just a byproduct of globalization? You know, this is my first question. And the last question was about this fascinating moment of the last colonial pilgrimage, which I must confess, I was totally ignoring this story. Maybe some of our guests know this, but could you just expand on that? I mean, so you told us that actually the French authority organized kind of monitored Hajj for 73 maybe pilgrims by plane. What about the other one? I mean, who were the Algerian pilgrims attending the Hajj at that moment? Were there other pilgrims? And what was the kind of relation between the FLN and the Hajj? Of course, we know that the FLN was not the kind of socialist and laicist and atheist liberation movement as we used to think about it. It had relationship very close with the ulama and the association of the ulama. But could you just expand on the relation between the FLN in Mecca, if you have some information about that, and the pilgrims, Algerian pilgrims, more specifically in Mecca? These are two of my questions, and after I will leave the floor to our guests. Thank you, Luc.
Okay, thank you, Philippe, for your question. So to answer your first question about the difference between the interwar pilgrimage and the pilgrimage during the Ottoman times, the objectives, the French objectives are the same. You know, it's to control, to monitor pilgrims and to avoid political connection in Hijaz. You know, because they fear that because the Hijaz is somewhat close to European influence, and colonial powers fear political reaction. That's the hidden pretext, you know, is political, because they fear any political reaction, any demonstration which could stem from the Hijaz and back to Algeria, for instance. You know, at the end of the 19th century, they fear something they call the pan-Islamism. That's to say, a political union of all Muslims under the protection of the Sultan Abdulhamid II. You know, and colonial power fear that Mecca could be a political center. In the interwar period, the political objective, the political preoccupation is quite similar. There is no khilaf and no khalif, okay, this disappeared, but they fear about pan-Arab leaders, pan-Arab, you know, chiefly Syrian leaders. And so they tried to bring together these pilgrims from Africa to control, to frame the circulation and to avoid any political relationships in Hijaz. I'm not sure if it's clear. Okay, but in the 19th century, the official pretext is sanitary condition. You know, there is cholera and plague in Mecca, so Algerian pilgrims are banned from doing their Hajj. You know, their Hajj is forbidden. During the interwar period, the pretext is an imperial identity to bring together a round trip with pilgrims from West Africa and North Africa to organize a somewhat luxury trip, a kind of propaganda, this imperial propaganda. But the hidden objective is to avoid any political relationship. Okay. To answer your second question about the relationship between the Algeria War of Independence and the Hajj, it's a very, very, very broad question. The problem is that I didn't present it during my lecture. After the Suez Crisis in 1956, diplomatic relationship between France and Saudi Arabia interrupt. So that's the reason why the French government decided to maintain an official pilgrimage, you know, exactly to oversee, to control possible connection between the FLN and the pilgrims. So in Algeria, the pilgrims who were authorized to go to Mecca were in very controlled territories, within controlled territories, okay? And on its part, the FLN had strong relationship with the movement of ulemas, Algerian ulemas, with Sheikh al-Ibrahimi, who was also present, you know, in Jeddah. And there was a strong connection between the Algerian ulemas and the FLN at that time. So sometimes the FLN decided to boycott the official pilgrimage. And sometimes at the beginning of the 60s, the FLN tried, on the contrary, to promote this pilgrimage because the Algerian government was recognized by the Saudi kingdom, you know, officially. And so the FLN was free to promote, to foster this pilgrimage of resistance against the French authorities. But up to the very beginning of the 60s, the French colonial government go on organizing an official pilgrimage. You know, that's two competitive pilgrimage. FLN pilgrimage is the French government official pilgrimage at the beginning of the 60s. It's a note thing.
Thank you, Rick. We have some questions. I will probably read it because I don't know if I have to open the mic or... So I will
maybe
read it
through the chat.
Yeah, through the chat. The first question is by Faisal. Hello, Faisal Abul Hassan. Which actually thank you for your presentation. And his question is about the restrictions on the Algerian pilgrimage. He wrote, you focus on hygiene and sanitary reasons, but yet you imply later that there are other colonial reasons for the restriction. So maybe it's related, I mean, as far as I can guess, with political issue, but maybe you can develop on that. Ask Faisal, what other reason do you see for these restrictions, and why do you focus on the hygiene or sanitation? And if I can take a couple of questions, Luc.
Yes.
Yeah, because the other question is quite short. It's by Jihan Al-Otaibi, who asks you, what makes you interested in this topic? And I think it's a question that has to be answered as well. So thank you, Jihan and Faisal, for these questions. And Luc, if you can answer, thank you.
Okay. The first question was about the restrictions, the colonial restriction.
Yeah.
Okay. The second question was about, I forgot.
I mean, other restrictions than sanitary reasons And
Okay.
why do you focus on the hygiene or sanitation? That was a question by
Okay,
Faisal.
the focus on sanitation. Okay.
Yeah, and the second one by Jihan. What makes you interested in this topic?
Okay. I will begin by the last question, which is the most difficult to answer. I don't know why. No, it's this subject is something fascinating, and was at the time I decided to study this question was not very developed in French history, you know, and the French diplomatic archives are very, very, very rich files about the pilgrimage to Mecca. And I did want to understand why a secular country, secular state like the French interfered so closely in the Hajj affairs. Why European government, a secular government like France, a gouvernement laïque, say in France, was so interested in the Hajj affairs? It was my main question. It was a kind of yes, interrogation. And you know, 15 years later, it's difficult to give a complete answer. Don't know. I met this lot, hundreds and hundreds of pages of archives, you know, and what is fascinating about the Hajj is that it's a global phenomenon, you know, because there is sanitary, there is of course religious, there is economics and politics fields, and it's a global object for an historian. It's something fascinating, you know. So the second reason why the other were colonial restriction at the end of the 19th century to the sanitary reason, of course, political reasons, of course, because at that time, you know, there is a lot of colonial wars, and the official reason is to protect Algerian pilgrims from wars in Libya or in Egypt. There is maybe ideological reasons, you know, because at that time, the French government in Paris was very hostile and opposite to religious influence and the Christian influence, the Catholicism, you know, and maybe French authorities tend to reproduce this fight, this model against the Catholic Church with Islam. You know, the Sultan Abdulhamid II is a kind of pope. The Muslim brotherhoods are like congregation, Catholic congregation, and the Catholic pilgrims who is going to Rome, or the Muslim pilgrims going to Mecca, is a fanatic. You know, at that time there was very rationalistic ideology, and maybe it could be another explanation. The first of all is sanitary reason, because there is very objective reason. You know, there is sanitary, there's cholera and plague, and so we have to forbid the pilgrimage that year. But there is many reasons: security, ideological, political, economic reason, because a lot of pilgrims, a lot of destitute pilgrims went on Mecca without sufficient money, and Algerian authorities, with the agreement of religious authorities, try to prevent the poor pilgrims to go on pilgrimage, you know, because they have to pay the way back after. And I focus on the sanitary reason because it's a great shift, you know, in the history of the Hajj, because sanitary organization had to be set up in the region with quarantine and after vaccination, and the sanitary factor has globally changed. You know, the Hajj has to be a more secure pilgrimage through vaccination, through medical inspection, through so it's very in the sanitary factor is the symptom of the global Hajj. You know, as with the Suez Canal, there is global exchange and global circulation of microbiome, and this medical Hajj. The Indian historian Saurabh Mishra speaks of sanitarization of Hajj, a medical Hajj, you know, and he say that the introduction of vaccination, of quarantine has completely changed, you know. There's now a global Hajj. I'm not sure if I answer it satisfactory.
If it is not satisfactory, Faisal can react, I think.
Yes.
About this sanitary global view on the Hajj, maybe you can also add the economic reason. I mean, I had a question in my mind while I was listening to your presentation, to your lecture. What about the relations between the Hajj entrepreneurs for the French Empire and the other one? Do you have some kind of partnerships between Indian and British Indian and French Algerian companies, for example, to deal with this business? Because as you mentioned, the globalization of the Hajj is also a globalization of profits and a globalization of tickets, ships, steamships, and things like that. But is this also an imperial globalization of economy, or the economics of the Hajj, or are we still in a national frame, you know, French with the French, or with Algerian pilgrims and Arabian pilgrims, British with the Indians, Dutch with the Javanese? I mean, can you expand on that, or do you have some more information about it?
There is not difficult to make a parallel because, as you say, Philippe, there is a strong connection between the British shipping companies and Indian merchants, for instance, or Dutch shipping companies and Javanese in Jeddah. For France, it's different because there is Algerian merchants in Hijaz. No, but the French government want to have the monopoly, you know, on the pilgrimage market. So because there is a lot of pressure for ship owner from Marseille, and so there was always the same companies, la Compagnie des Chargeurs Réunis, la Compagnie Cyprien Fabre, and during the interwar, we can see Algerian ship owners, but from European origin. There is, I think, twice a Muslim ship owner, but he was living in Paris. It's different, for instance, in Algeria, when the French government want to build the French monopoly on this pilgrimage market. It's different from the situation in the French mandate in Syria and Lebanon, where the French try to promote local companies, you know, like the Compagnie Aidée in Lebanon. It was an obligation. It was the mandate. Obligation. French had to build national shipping companies. So French try to promote local entrepreneurs, local ship owners to organize, like it's just some concessions to organize the pilgrimage, because it's an international obligation. In Algeria, French wants the national rules to be enforced. And there is a few cooperation. Some Muslim entrepreneurs close to the Algerian ulemas try to promote a free pilgrimage, but there were restrictions from Algiers.
We are close to the 1 hour standard, but we also have another question by Justin.
Yes.
who is asking about the real fear of pan-Islamism behind of the Hajj. Was there really something like pan-Islamism in Mecca until the beginning of the 20th century, or was it only a kind of Orientalistic or European fear about the Hajj?
Yes.
Could you give us some ideas about that?
It's very difficult to have a precise answer because it's chiefly a kind of, as you said, Orientalistic representation, very, very useful for colonial powers, you know, because pan-Islamism seems like a plot. So it's a very good pretext, you know, to have soldiers, to colonial wars. It's and to spread influence. But the Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II play on this argument pan-Islamism. He had, for instance, to open consular offices in India. He relied on Muslim brotherhoods to try to spread his influence, you know, to contest the European influence. But he was chiefly a rhetoric tool. You know, is the fear of a general jihad or something like that, because the French and British at that time took control of Ottoman territories in Tunisia or Egypt. Though it's kind of rhetoric suite, you know, which was used by the Ottoman Sultan. But it was also a useful tool for colonial powers to create, you know, a kind of a plot and to justify imperial conquest.
Yeah.
But Mecca, yes, is identified like a kind of pan-Islamic center, because of course how Muslim met in at Mecca at that time, so it was very useful. You know, and the interpretation was very, very, very political, over politically interpretation, you know, at that time. It was sure that Mecca was not only a religious place, but a political place, a kind of Muslim forum. It's a great phantasm for European powers at that time, you know, because when you're Mecca, you're out, yes, you're out of the empire, and there is no possibility to control, to frame the pilgrims. And for imperial ideology, it's something yes, worrisome.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, your own book and the book by Scott Rees about the Indian Hajj, and even Nye Green about the fascinating accounts of Indian and even Russian Hajj to Mecca, are precisely hinting at what you said, that mainly the main pan-Islamic center was not Mecca, but the route to Mecca. On the boats, on some stay over in Bombay, in Karachi, and even in lesser towns on route. I mean, be it on the railway or on steamship toward Mecca and Jeddah. And so the main pan-Islamic forum was maybe the Hajj in itself, rather than Mecca and things like that. I mean, at least as far as we can guess from the sources, available sources, and what I understood from your own book and the other book, so by Nye Green and Scott Reed and the other one, Hajj, which is actually a fascinating and an expanding field of research since the last 20 years. I don't know why, but there is a kind of explosion which is fascinating and letting us discover a world that was up to a certain extent that is lost now. Can I add a last question, Luc, just to conclude? I know it's a kind of sensitive question, but I would like to have your opinion about what is now the role of the previous colonial powers in the Hajj today. Do we still have a kind of colonial monitoring of the Hajj today? Of course, I'm mainly thinking about France. for its own Muslim citizens, but also about the role of France in the region or India. Just an idea that occurred to my mind as I was listening to the lecture. You can say, I don't have any idea.
Difficult because I think the French Foreign Office, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs are completely forgotten this history, you know, and the official, I think the official position is not to intervene in the Hajj affairs. It's a private affairs. You could say no, Hajj is a collective phenomenon. No, no, no. For French government, it's a private affair, and so it's a travel agency's affairs. You know, maybe, of course, there's we see it. This topic last summer. There is a sanitary issue. Though there is a duty of information. You can see on the French side information about sanitary condition and so on. But the paradox is that now that French Muslim pilgrims, we are requiring more protection for France, but in France, you know, against some kind of tricks, some travel agency tricks. And some French pilgrims would like that the French government intervene, but in France, in French territory, you know, to regulate the Hajj market, because sometimes there is a black market or tricks. But officially, of course, France did not anymore intervene in this kind of affairs. I think that the British government tried to organize 1 year kind of not an official delegation, but an organization, a collective organization. But he had to give up. This is chiefly yes, a confessional business, confessional affairs.
And Laurent Bonnefoy is just sending me some message because he wanted to ask you: is there a kind of non-colonial model for the Hajj? I mean, be it today, what about the non-colonial powers? Historically, non-colonial powers now, how do they deal with the Hajj? And historically, can we think about the non-imperial history of the Hajj?
Yes, about, for instance, a national history, a collection of national histories of the Hajj. Maybe with the end of the imperial pilgrimage, of the colonial pilgrimage, it's a very, very large history, which is at an end, and maybe which is a new period with a national, with in each Muslim country, you know, you have ministries of religious affair or not Hajj affairs. Saudi Kingdom, but really in Morocco, there is ministry, yes, of religious affairs.
Really have a different way of dealing with the Hajj. Is there really, I mean, do these countries who don't have a colonial past, do they deal in a different way?
Yes, I think maybe in Malaysia, I think we try to organize a kind of public Hajj for poor pilgrims. In Malaysia, there was endeavors, you know, Eric Tagliacozzo wrote a fascinating book. Yes, it was a special organizer. There is a public organization for rich pilgrims and also with the charities objective for poor pilgrims. Though in India, which is a secular state, wants to subsidize the pilgrimage of Indian Muslim, not Pakistan, India. Try to subsidize, you know, shipping companies, but it's not very original. British did the same, but in Malaysia and in Indonesia too, there was sometimes public endeavors to organize, yeah, with of course political purposes.
Anyway, thank you very much, Luc, for this fascinating lecture, which was the last of our academic year. 2020-2021. We, of course, we shall launch another one with a new topic next year in September. Thank you to all of our guests today, and for the question by Jehan, Faisal, Justine, Laurent, and everybody. And see you in September for, I hope, CEFREPA lecture series, which won't be only online, but maybe we could do it in the garden, which is expecting for guests, which has been expecting for guests for the last year and a half. Thank you, everybody, and see you soon in September at the CEFREPA lecture series.